Hey everybody, today we are debating whether or not Jesus rose from the dead, and we're starting right now. Hello friends, glad to be here with you. This is going to be a blast. I am honestly so excited. Oh my goodness, lots of energy over here. It's going to be a great stream. So we are thrilled to have our guest here today. It's going to be epic. You guys have seen TJump. He is a fierce debater, as I have mentioned before. I've got to cross swords with Tom myself. I can tell you, very well read, very quick on his feet. And we also have Gregory, also known in the title of the video as Prodigy Gregory, because it's true, Gregory is 12 years old. However, don't consider his age. Instead, judge him based on his arguments, how much he's read, the level of what he's read, and how quick he is on his feet. And I think you will see that this is going to be a fierce debate. So, with that, just want to mention, if this is your first time here, we're excited to have you here. We try to be a neutral channel. So, whether you are a Christian, atheist, Jedi, or even Sith, we're glad that you're here. We want you to feel welcome. And so, if you enjoy debates like this, consider hitting that subscribe button, as we've got a lot more coming up. Also, want to mention, we are pumped to you could say that in a way we sponsor them. They don't pay us, we don't pay them, but we just want to give them shout outs because we are all for Be The Match, which is a non-partisan organization, so they're not Christian or atheist. They basically are just focused on getting people's bone marrow, of which they cover the medical costs. Basically, you can check them out at bethematch.org, where they can send you a free kit to where you would swab the inside of your cheek. They would have your DNA on file, and then you can basically say, hey, or I should say, they can say, hey, we found a match. Somebody who has, it's oftentimes people with leukemia, it's a cancer of the blood. They'll say, hey, we found a match. There's somebody that needs you to be a donor. And they, like I said, they cover all of the medical expenses. So just wanted to mention that. We are thrilled about that organization and want to give them a lot of shout outs. So back to the debate. Want to let you know both of the speakers are linked below. I should say Gregory, as of now, doesn't have a link yet. He is considering it. But Tom's channel, which has many debates, and we want to let you know about wherever the debates are happening, we want to let you know about it. Tom has tons of debates on his channel. So if you enjoy this, probably enjoy his channel as well. He's linked below. And with that, want to just introduce you to the format, and then we are going to rock and or roll. So 20-minute openings, that's optional, so the debaters can take as much or little of that as they feel they want to, and then a 40-minute open discussion. So civil discourse style, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A. If you have questions, feel free to just shoot those into the live chat. I will fish those out, and then I will compile them into a list and ask them to the debater that you want me to ask them to. Last, we appreciate so much that people are so friendly at this channel. Like 99.9% of the people, they debate so well in the sense that they're like chill, easygoing, friendly, and we appreciate that so much. We do want to mention it once in a while. This is like 0.01% of the people that jump into the live chat. Once in a while, it's a little bit abusive toward the debaters. So we want to ask if you would be willing to be kind to the debaters. It's totally cool to say, oh man, that idea just doesn't make sense, and here's why. Feel free, we love it. But when it comes to like sometimes saying heinous things about people that are debating, it's like our debaters aren't going to come back if that 0.01% is calling them terrible names. They might not feel welcome. So with that, don't want to take any more time. I want to say thank you again to the 99.9% of people that are always just so gracious when they do debate in the live chat. We love it. So, given that Gregory is taking the affirmative, Gregory will start. Gregory, I have the clock set for 20 minutes, and on your first word, I will let it rip. So, thanks again to our speakers for being here, spending their time with us, and Gregory, the floor is yours.
Thank you, James, and thank you very much, TJump, for being willing to debate me. So when we talk about the resurrection, first of all, before we get into the historical evidence for the resurrection, we need to establish two facts. The first being that Jesus died by crucifixion just outside of Jerusalem. This fact is unanimously accepted among scholars, And the reason for that is because, first of all, one, Tacitus in Annals 1544, first of all, said that Christ was executed under Pilate. Maribor Serapion in the Syriac manuscript implies that Jesus was executed. Lucian in also in the Death of Peregrine also says that Christ was executed. Celsus in Organ Contra Celsum 68 also makes that claim. Josephus, the uninterpolated version, there's some interpolated versions, but this one's an uninterpolated version, in Antiquities of the Jews 18.3.3 also says that Jesus died by crucifixion outside of Jerusalem. Another fact that we must go by is that Jesus was buried in a nearby tomb. This is overwhelmingly attested in Mark 15:42 to 16:8. Now, this is in the early Passion narrative, and was most likely early. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:3 to 7:8, and we'll unpack the reasons for why that's early in a bit. And Josephus in Jewish War 4.317. And which they agree that crucified victims received a proper burial. And Jewish law also demanded that foreigners and criminals had to be buried in Deuteronomy 21:23 and Josephus, and against Appian 2.211. We also have archaeological evidence that gives context to this, which is that in Yohanan ben Hagalga's crucifixion. And the burial of Jesus also meets the criteria of embarrassment, since they had to admit that they cannot afford a tomb to bury Jesus in. But with that in mind, let's get into the various theories that scholars have proposed can account for this. The mythic theory says that this was a myth after the crucifixion and burial. Jesus' resurrection was just made up by later Christians. The conspiracy theory says that the disciples made this up for their own gain. And the hallucination theory says that the disciples were grief-stricken and had hallucinations that Jesus had risen from the dead, and which propelled them to think that he was alive again. And some scholars have proposed combinations of this. And this will always come back down to the resurrection theory, which is that Jesus rose from the dead. So let's start off with the first fact, which is that the disciples said that Jesus appeared to them alive. This fact is unanimously accepted among scholars. Bart Ehrman says, I don't doubt at all that the disciples claimed this. Paul, writing about 25 years later, indicates that this is what they claimed, and I don't think he's making it up. And the reason and evidence for this is, one, has multiple attestations in Paul's epistles, Mark, John, Matthew, Luke, and Acts, and Josephus. And there's no way to explain the rise of Christianity if this didn't happen. So now, why is this the case? So to delve deeper into why this is the case is, for instance, Paul preserved an early creed in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, which is a list that Jesus was said to have appeared to. He includes Peter, the rest of the disciples, James, the 500 people at once, and other apostles. So most scholars would say this goes back to within 3 years of Pentecost, and the reasons for this are overwhelming. First of all, it's formed in a mnemonic structure with parallelism. It's less than 100 words, and this seems to be an early creed that was catechizing Christians, because it says, "For I delivered unto you as of first importance what I also received." So this is basically a rabbinic statement of a teacher passing on something down to his students, of which he was taught. So it really did have to come from the disciples very early on before they could basically teach it to Paul. And the creed also calls Peter Cephas, and not by his original name Peter, which was a later nickname taken from Matthew 16:18. It has an independent tradition that's not basically contingent on the Gospels. So the strong majority of gospel atheists and scholars, atheists and Christian alike, agree that this creed dates back to about 80-30 to 35. So this rules out the myth theory as exceptionally improbable. The hallucination theory says that this is a hallucination experienced by the disciples. And the problem with this is that it says that hallucinations happen in group settings, 1 Corinthians 15:3-7-8, and group hallucinations are exceptionally rare. For instance, peer-reviewed works on hallucinations have shown that hallucinations often manifest in one sensory mode, such as auditory and visual, and multimode hallucinations are usually exceptionally rare. So for a hallucination to explain these appearances, you would have to agree that the disciples are all each having a rare multimode hallucination, and they are all agreeing that Jesus is doing certain things, like eating and drinking and giving them the same exact instructions. So even if you could write the Gospels and Acts off as later myths, we still have the early creed in 1 Corinthians 15, which reports group settings and some specifically early sermons and Acts, which are preserved, and which reports that Jesus ate and drank with the disciples. That's Acts 10:34-43. And C.H. Dodd notes that the speeches and Acts seem exceptionally early, and this was in Apostolic Preaching and its Developments, page 19-27, because they lack influence from traditional Pauline theology or vocabulary. They contain a high degree of Semitism, meaning they are most likely originally Aramaic, and they lack resemblance to the originally written elements of Acts, meaning they likely predate traditional Acts and are early Aramaic speeches of oral tradition. So with this, the hallucination theory seems exceptionally improbable. But there is one other thing. It's called the power of suggestion. In animalistic psychology, a study of extraordinary phenomena, behavior, and experience, Warren H. Jones and Leonard Zusna read the literature on the groups of hallucinations, which happens to be very little. And they talked about a place where 70,000 people said that they witnessed a public miracle. However, the reports varied. Like, although the children reportedly saw the Virgin, the crowd, at least many of them, like, they had seen a color phenomenon. And expectation and excitement were definitely not present, as the narratives embarrassingly portray the disciples as basically running for their lives after Jesus was crucified, and they doubted the report of women. And women had a very low status in the ancient world. And they also were frightened when they saw Jesus. This is in Luke 24:37-38. And secondly, it's interesting that if the appearances were hallucinations, they basically do not fit the criteria that's traditionally associated with it. The conspiracy theory, however, I think can account for this fact, because even though it's hard to posit such a mass hallucination, it is possible, not a mass hallucination, sorry, a conspiracy like this where they may have lied about it, I would say it's still possible, and I'll grant the conspiracy theory to this fact. The second fact is appearances to skeptics. And this is also unanimous. It's almost unanimously accepted that the James and his brothers were not his followers before his crucifixion. It's also unanimously accepted that Paul was an enemy of the church and originally a later convert, which he quotes in Galatians 1:20-23. And Paul, so right, Galatians 1:22-23 was very early, and mentioning that James was an early skeptic would not have been made up, as no Christian would dare to dishonor, shame, or lie about one of their leaders in such a way, and the fact would not have been later made up. Yet it's clear through early creeds, Galatians 1:19, 2:9-12, 1 Corinthians 15:7, which we've already established as true, and Josephus' Jewish Antiquities 20.9.1. The conspiracy also has an extremely hard time accounting for this, as why on earth would they have lied? Because they were a small, persecuted, and hated minority with the Messiah, who was literally just shamefully crucified, and they couldn't even afford their own tomb, as we said earlier. And Jesus dishonored the family, and James had already opposed him, and suddenly James makes up something like this. And Paul also had no reason to do this. He persecuted the church, as he admits in Philippians 3:4-6, and he also partook in the stoning of the apostles in Acts 6:8-8:1, and we've established that there were early sermons that reported this, and suddenly everything was going from him. Suddenly has an urge to leave is, I would say, a lie, and to be a miracle in and of itself. Well, what if they were both hallucinating? Well, this starts to create a theory to be less parsimonious once you add more hallucinations to it. And the plausibility of Paul having a hallucination is extremely low, as he had no background, as he was against the church, and usually hallucinations have some kind of expectation to them. So, all right, let's move on to third fact, which is that the immediate proclamation, which is not that, like the disciples believed, which was first of all, they immediately proclaimed in Jerusalem, like Tacitus mentions that the first evil broke out in Judea in Annals 1544, and yeah, so he reports in Galatians 2:1 and 2:9 that they were first preaching in Jerusalem, and then also Tacitus and Paul also, as well as we've already said, suggest that Jerusalem is where Christianity began. So the mythic theory, as we know, cannot account for this fact, and the conspiracy theory definitely cannot account for this fact, as they literally went up and said, "You have crucified your Messiah, and he has been raised." So these people are either crazy or absolutely convinced that they're right. So the conspiracy theory seems to be hopeless in accounting for this. And also, they voluntarily suffered for their disciples and witnesses. Like in Annals 1544, Tacitus reports in Suetonius 2.51, they said, and Jerusalem also in Antiquities 20.9.1. And Paul also reported intense persecution early on. There's a later epistle in 1 Clement 15:3-6, which also claimed this. And so yeah, as we can tell, the mythic and conspiracy theory have a hard time accounting for this, and the hallucination theory, I believe, probably can account for this fact, as they could have should be a miraculous and wild hallucination, but I think it's still possible. Okay, the last fact is the empty tomb. So Gary Habermas has surveyed the material written on the resurrection by scholars, and it's basically found that 75% of scholars accept the empty tomb was found empty the tomb was found empty on Easter morning. And the evidence for this is overwhelming. But some scholars like John Dominic Crossan believe that Jesus wasn't buried in a tomb, but they were thrown in a trench for dogs to eat. But this theory flies in a large pillar of evidence. For instance, Dale C. Allison, who is skeptical of a resurrection, says a toff would rarely be used for the dumping of criminals in a trench for dogs to eat. Also, the account of early accounts for the burial would also be incompatible with John Dominic Crossan's argument. As we said, Mark, 1 Corinthians, and Jewish war. And the archaeological evidence. Also, the Romans were okay with other Jewish practices going on in Jerusalem that they detested, such as temple worship, keeping the Sabbath, having their own temple guards. So I don't understand why they wouldn't keep this practice as well. So also, all right. So such a group had so this would have been pretty humiliating, and the fact that they mentioned that he was basically in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea also means that the tomb is public knowledge and its whereabouts known. But as we've already stated, this is also embarrassing because women had discovered the empty tomb, and they were thought of as they had a very low status in ancient culture. And the reason why this tomb would be empty is because, first of all, and said by Trypho the Jew, chapter 108, he says that the disciples stolen by night from the tomb because they had to come up with an explanation to this empty tomb. So they come up with what we call the conspiracy theory at this point. And the conspiracy theory, that's why the conspiracy was the earliest theory, because they had to account for the empty tomb. So why is there an empty tomb? Well, if the Sanhedrin had the body, then they could just have the Gentiles bring it out and basically show the tomb was never empty. And Rome wouldn't have cared at this point. If the tomb was empty, then Rome could have just dispelled the rats and showed the empty tomb as well. That's getting back to that. So how do we account for the empty tomb? Well, could we say that Jerusalem, the Jewish people the Jewish leaders had taken the body? Well, they wanted Jesus crucified, shamed, buried, and forgotten. And the Rome would not have cared at this point, so we would have to say that Christians had stolen the body. But this doesn't seem to work either, because like, for instance, if they'd stolen the body, then why would they have reported the theory that Jewish leaders were spreading? And and also there was it was flooded with pilgrims at the time as it was Passover, so they would have been seen and caught, and they wouldn't have embarrassingly reported that they had not understood that Jesus had predicted his rise. There's no, and yeah, and the Jewish authorities would come after them, so there's no reason why they'd do such a risky thing. So for the conspiracy theory to work, we need to posit the disciples, who were in fear for their lives, somehow decided to steal a body, fake the resurrection, managed to get the body out of the Sanhedrin section of town, and hide the body in an overcrowded city with pilgrims. So the entire theory just basically reduces down to overwhelming unlikelihood. The hallucination theory doesn't appear to work either, because we would have to posit that all of Jerusalem hallucinated, and as we've shown, these mass hallucinations don't work like this. And the mythic theory doesn't work, as we've already shown the evidence for the empty tomb. So, with the rise of these facts, what we have to do is, since we've shown that the resurrection theory can account for these facts well, we need to come up with another theory that can better account for this fact than the resurrection, because the resurrection can easily account for this fact. And in order to show that the Jesus most likely did not rise, we have to come up with a better explanation than the resurrection and find alternate evidence against the resurrection that would work. So in conclusion, until we can find a better historical explanation than the resurrection, which was shown to account for these facts, we cannot claim, we can say that the resurrection is most likely, as it can better account for the facts. Sorry if I've been a little bit stuttering, and sorry about that. So yeah.
Thank you very much, Gregory. So there's 3 minutes left, so just in time. And Tom, I will load up the timer, and thank you as well for being here. The floor is yours.
All right, so if I told you I saw a real living, breathing dog, you should believe me. However, if I told you I saw a real living, breathing unicorn, you should not believe me. The difference between these two statements is that dogs have an implicit empirical basis, meaning there are many things about dogs that we can have and used in the past to make testable predictions, such as their bones, DNA, chemical composition, taxonomy, phylogeny, embryology, training, allergies, etc. Therefore, dogs already have an empirical basis that makes it reasonable to believe that they physically exist. Even if I only say I saw a dog, that conceptual evidence of my testimony, combined with this empirical evidence that we already have of dogs, this implicit empirical basis, makes it reasonable to believe that I saw a real living dog. However, unicorns do not have an implicit empirical basis. Therefore, they would require an explicit empirical basis before any amount of testimony claiming to have seen one was reasonable to believe. By explicit empirical basis, I mean providing examples of things that can be used to make testable predictions. In the case of unicorns, that would be like a DNA sample, a location where to find one, pet one, fossils, any of those kinds of things. So without any kind of an empirical basis, the testimony of saying I saw a unicorn is not sufficient to believe unicorns actually exist or that I actually saw a real living, breathing unicorn. But it is for the claim I saw a dog, because dogs have an implicit empirical basis. Historical claims are a form of testimony, so they work the exact same way. If the claims already have an implicit empirical basis, they are prima facie reasonable to accept. If they don't have an implicit empirical basis, then an explicit empirical basis must be provided before they are reasonable to accept. Therefore, anything that lacks an empirical basis, such as miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, or UFOs, would all need an explicit empirical basis before they are reasonable to accept based on any amount of testimony. However, it is reasonable to believe such claims to be combinations of any mental construction or embellishment due to fallacies, biases, illusions, delusions, hallucinations, confabulations, misattributions, misunderstandings, misconceptions, inventions, or imagination, as all of those are conceptual conclusions. Therefore, they only require the conceptual evidence of testimony. Therefore, any eyewitness testimony of I saw does not have an empirical basis. If it does not have an empirical basis, then it is functionally equivalent to saying I imagined I saw. Similar arguments presented by Hume and Hitchens and many historians. As Hume said, there is not to be found in all history any miracle attested by a sufficient number of men of such unquestioned good sense, education, and learning as to secure us all delusion in themselves. And as Hitchens said, what is more likely, that the laws of nature have been suspended in your favor and that in a way that you approve, or that you have made a mistake? Now, neither Hume or Hitchens nor historians, so what do historians say on the matter? As to quote Michael Licona, a Christian historian, most biblical scholars and historians hold to the investigation of miracle reports lies outside of the rights of a historian acting within their professional capacity. And to go in further by a secular historian, Robert Webb, definitional limitation. What is usually understood to constitute history is not making an ontological statement about the totality of reality. Those whose worldview includes a supernatural realm and the possibility of theistic causation may respond in two ways. They may define the breadth of history to include the possibility of divine causation, or they may view this understanding to be definitional limitation of the modern discipline of history and how it functions without it being an ontological statement about the nature of reality. This latter view I could call methodological naturalistic history. In other words, for the purpose of doing historical work, the historian is methodologically limited to causation within the physical space-time universe. But this does not limit the historian's personal ontological worldview, just his historical method as a historian. Therefore, without any empirical basis, no amount of testimony can justify miracles. It's not even an option on the table. So any of these other alternatives, like delusion, miscommunication, interpretation, all of those things are necessarily better explanations because they have an empirical basis.
Yeah.
I'm good. I'm done.
You got it. So thank you very much, Tom. And want a quick mention, because I always forget a couple of things. One is, if you have a question, we did mention you can shoot it in a live chat. I'll scoop them out. Super Chats also allows you to make a comment toward one of the debaters during the question and answer, and Super Chats automatically go to the list, the top of the list that we read from. Also, very excited for tomorrow, as G-Man will be on tomorrow, and yes, this is the real thumbnail we will be using. So, very excited about that, as G-Man will be debating friends from the Black Hebrew Israelite movement. So, that is going to be a high energy debate. We're looking forward to it, and hopefully we'll see you there tomorrow at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So with that, back to the debate. We are now going into the open discussion portion. So we have 40 minutes set, and the floor is yours, gentlemen.
Okay, so all right. Let's first off with your Humean claims about how miracles are about miracles. Okay, so Hume's mistake, I would say, is that he has not evaluated all of human experience, and our human experience cannot establish unalterable laws. Like, if we say, for instance, that human experience creates laws of nature that cannot be violated, then how do we account for people who have reported miracles in their experience? In fact, the percentage of people who have claimed to see a spiritual experience is in 1975. There was a study done, and 35% of people at the time had claimed to see a spiritual experience. In 1978, a study found that 36% of people had claimed to see a spiritual experience. In 2000, I think BBC had done a study which claimed that 76% of people have claimed to see a spiritual experience. And in 2009, the Pew Research Center found that 49% of people have claimed to see a spiritual experience. With that,
just sorry to interrupt, Sister Mel, but if I show an optical illusion to every human who's ever lived, they're all going to see it moving. So the number of people who claim to have seen spiritual experiences doesn't in any way help the claim that they actually did.
Whether it's an illusion or not does not whether it's an illusion or not is not the point. The point is that Hume's mistake in claiming that humans have not at least claimed to see it. It's about the humans reporting to see a spiritual experience.
Well, Hume never said they didn't.
It's not about whether they're fact or not. It's that it's not. We need to. You need to show how this, because human experience has reported that. Like, for instance, there's this analogy that an Indian prince who has never seen ice before, just because he has never seen ice before because he lives in a hot climate, does not mean anything. Your personal experience of how the world works does not make unalterable laws. So Hume's experience and the apostles' experience are different in this respect. Hume may have never seen it before, but the apostles had claimed to see it before. So to enter into philosophical supernaturality and miracles, and to claim that miracles somehow don't work because of this, and they violate the laws of nature, I mean, that may be correct in and of itself, but the problem is that the resurrection is not a natural explanation; it's a supernatural explanation. For instance,
Right, but that wasn't my argument. That's just a part of the quote of Hume. Like my argument, like my entire introduction, was that no amount of eyewitness testimony can justify things that don't have an empirical basis, which includes miracles, but it also includes magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, and UFOs. It's like if I told you I saw a unicorn, you shouldn't believe me. If I told you I saw a dog, you should believe me. The difference between these two claims is that dogs have an implicit empirical basis, which the combination of the conceptual testimony of I saw with the empirical basis of the dogs that makes it reasonable to believe. But the unicorn, because it only has the conceptual evidence of I saw and does not have an empirical basis, it's unreasonable to believe. And this pattern holds through all of the examples I listed: miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, UFOs. None of those are reasonable to believe based on someone saying, I saw this. No amount of testimony can justify those. You need empirical evidence.
Okay, if you give me enough if you give me enough evidence for you seeing a unicorn, then I would probably accept that. If you give me evidence and you said these naturalistic theories cannot account for this, then I would go for it. I would not assume an already implicit. I would not implicitly assume that the probability is low, or that these claims are immediately unsupported. I would not do that. I would go for the evidence, see what the evidence is. If there's much better naturalistic explanations for it, then I would go for those naturalistic explanations. Until then, they are merely possible explanations, and possibility does not entail probability.
Right. Well, natural explanations are necessarily better than supernatural explanations because we have no evidence of the supernatural. Like if you actually presented evidence of the supernatural, like empirical, testable, futurable predictions, that would be good evidence. I'd be happy to accept that. But if all you have is testimony, which is all that you've presented so far, no amount of testimony qualifies as evidence of the supernatural. It's not even a possibility. It doesn't add up to a single point at all in the direction of the supernatural. You have to present empirical evidence. No amount of testimony justifies this.
No. Okay, I don't need to. No, first of all, I don't need to show possibility. For instance, that's a fallacy. That's shifting the burden of proof. If there's possible, if X is possible, there's enough evidence for it. I would still go for that thing.
Right, but I didn't say that. Anything's possible. I mean, Jesus' resurrection could be explained by magical leprechauns or blue fairies, but the fact that it's possible doesn't give us anything. Like, you need actual evidence to justify your conclusion. And
to justify that Jesus was most likely resurrected?
What?
That Jesus most likely resurrected?
Well, if I grant Jesus resurrected, I could explain that by blue fairies or magical leprechauns or a genie in a bottle. There are lots of possible explanations. But the possible explanations don't account for anything because they all cancel each other out. Any possible explanation, there's infinitely many of them, they all cancel each other out to add up to exactly zero probability, or as infinitely close to zero as you can get.
Yeah.
So you need some kind of evidence. And conceptual testimony, no amount of conceptual testimony is evidence, which is why most historians reject the claim that history can account for miracles. It's just not in the branch of history because history only has testimony, which is not sufficient to justify claims of miracles.
All right. Mm-hmm. Okay. So, as you said earlier, these are infinitely close to zero. They're 1 divided by infinity probability. But the point is that the resurrection theory can account for these facts, and none of the naturalistic theories that I've seen so far can account for these facts. Again, the miracles, you need to justify why miracles are by definition. Sorry if I'm strawmanning, but if miracles are the least probable explanation here. Sorry if I'm strawmanning, by the way, about that point. Maybe it's different. That's how I understood your point.
Right, that's correct, because miracles don't have any evidence. There is no evidence of miracles. And the reason there is no evidence of miracles is because you have to have empirical evidence. Testimony isn't evidence.
Why do I need to have natural evidence? Why do I need to have completely natural evidence? Why are miracles improbable, and therefore I should accept the naturalistic explanation that's there rather than the miracle explanation?
Because everything that we experience can be explained by infinitely many different alternatives. Like, it could be explained by leprechauns or a genie in a bottle or fairies. And the only way to tell which of these infinitely many explanations is the best explanation is we have to be able to differentiate the imaginary ones from the ones that are justifiable to believe. And the way we do that is future testable predictions. That's the whole point of science. What science does is it tells us this explanation isn't just one of the infinitely many imaginary things we made up in our heads. It's something we have reason to believe. So right now, all you... What?
Sorry, did you want to continue?
No, go ahead.
No, but possibility does not entail probability. You see, that's the problem. It's not just
I didn't say that.
There's an infinite amount of possible explanations, sure, but yes. Actually, you know what? Yeah, you're right. We have to differentiate and find the probable ones. Is that what you were going to say?
Right, we have to differentiate between the ones that we made up in our heads, because we can make up a lot. We can say the entire world was created 5 minutes ago and all this is imaginary. That's a natural explanation that can explain all of the data. Or we could say that the quantum fluctuations created a Boltzmann brain and all of these memories are just illusory. That's a natural explanation that can explain all of the data. We could say that leprechauns created this entire universe and just made Jesus rise from the dead as just a joke. That can explain all of the data. There are infinitely many ways that we can use to explain all of the data, both natural and supernatural and ubernatural and super duper natural in every possible way. So you need to filter out the imaginary ones that we made up in our imagination and show which of these is actually justified, the most probable, as you put it, that actually caused the event.
Right,
now,
but
to do that,
yeah, sorry.
To do that, we need empirical evidence. Empirical evidence is what does that. It filters out the imaginary ones. That's the whole point of empirical evidence. That's what science does. So if you can't meet that, you would need some other kind of criteria to filter out the imaginary explanations. I don't know of any such criteria. I use the empirical method because it works. And by the empirical method, that rules out miracles because there isn't any empirical evidence of miracles, just like there isn't any empirical evidence of magical leprechauns or a Boltzmann brain or the fact that we're in the Matrix.
Two things. First of all, explaining the data is different from best explaining the data. Something could have complete explanatory scope, but it's only a possible explanation. So the explanation, for instance, you gave we cannot assign any probability to it. The only probability to it is because it's merely a possibilistic explanation. Possible explanation. 1 divided by infinity. What I'm saying is that the resurrection theory best explains the data than these other theories. So unless you can provide a better explanation for this, then we can go by those standards.
Right. I'm arguing that your explanation of a magical resurrection is exactly the same probabilistically as magical leprechauns or blue juju fairies.
All right, why
because
is that?
there is no evidence of the resurrection, just like there is no evidence of fairies. There is exactly the same amount of evidence for the resurrection as there is for fairies.
Yes, there is. There's historical evidence. Empirical evidence is
historical evidence is testimony. Testimony isn't empirical, so testimony isn't evidence. So there's exactly the same evidence for the resurrection as for fairies.
Empirical evidence is not the only kind of evidence. Empirical evidence is not the only kind of evidence. There's historical evidence, there's philosophical evidence, there's mathematical evidence, there's many other kinds of evidences. Empirical and scientific, or maybe not scientific, but empirical evidence in and of itself is not the only kind of evidence. So again, you need to justify that.
Right, because that's the quotes of the historians I gave who explicitly said no amount of testimony can make ontological claims about the nature of reality. You have to exclude the supernatural because testimony can't justify these kinds of claims. You need empirical evidence.
Right.
So historians, like most historians, as the Michael Licona quote said, most biblical scholars and historians say that the study of history claims lies outside of the bounds of historian acting within their professional capacity. And then I gave a quote with Robert Webb explaining why, which is because the testimony can't make claims about ontology, about the nature of reality. It's a description of what's in our heads. Our personal experience, our personal testimony isn't a description of, or isn't evidence of new categories of things. That's not how it works. Which is why in my introduction, I started with the statement, if I told you I saw a dog, that's reasonable. If I told you I saw a unicorn, that's not reasonable. No amount of testimony of a unicorn is ever evidence of a unicorn. You need some kind of empirical evidence. Doesn't matter how many people saw a unicorn. Doesn't matter how many people think a unicorn resurrected from the dead. It makes no difference at all. Like there are hundreds of accounts of Bigfoot. We don't take that as evidence Bigfoot exists. There are thousands of accounts of the Loch Ness Monster. We don't count that as evidence that the Loch Ness Monster exists. There are tens of thousands of accounts of aliens. We don't count that as evidence that aliens exist. There are hundreds of thousands of accounts of ghosts. We don't count that as evidence that ghosts exist. There are millions of testimony accounts that homeopathy can heal people. We don't count that as evidence that homeopathy can heal people. And if I showed every single human being on the planet a picture of an optical illusion, they will all see it moving. That isn't evidence it's moving. no amount of testimony can justify an empirical claim about the world. You need empirical evidence.
Okay, right. Okay, so first of all, historical. All right. So first of all, historical evidence. This historical evidence has a philosophical background to it, which is that the supernatural is possible. Building from that, we can build historical claims. I start off with a philosophical thing and then build a historical case. Two.
Well, we'll do, just to interrupt right there. Like you said at the beginning, remember, possibility isn't probability. So the possibility that the supernatural exists is no different than the possibility that magical blue leprechauns exist.
That's
so
right.
That's on the same level.
That's not what I said. Though. I said that there's already a philosophical possibility from it, and then I'm creating historical probability based on that. If there was philosophical impossibility, I cannot create historical probability. And second of all,
right. But so just to say, there's also philosophical possibility of blue magical leprechauns. So you're still on the same level as the blue magical leprechauns right now.
Right. These blue magical leprechauns, we need historical evidence for. Until then,
no. The philosophical possibility is always there. So the philosophical possibility of the supernatural is exactly the same as the philosophical possibility of blue magical leprechauns.
Correct.
So those are on equal footing.
Correct, but I don't argue that we cannot prove blue leprechauns. I believe that that it's possible, but unless that evidence is presented, historical, whatever, whatever you want, I will not accept. I will not accept that. But I am providing historical evidence from this, and then we have to respond to that. So the second thing
I presented the historical evidence of homeopathy with the millions of accounts of people attesting that homeopathy can heal people. None of that counts as evidence because it's not. The testimony, the historical testimony, isn't evidence. That's the whole point. You keep presenting these non-evidences as evidences.
Okay, so my argument wasn't just like testimony. I included the empty tomb as well, and they all added up to a cumulative case for the resurrection. Like the disciples said, I already said, like the conspiracy theory can account for that, and maybe if they were all like 500 people at once, then yeah. And then I added the disciples believed, like because of the voluntary suffering of the disciples and witnesses, and the fact that they immediately proclaimed in Jerusalem, even though they knew that they could have been martyred and killed for it. And I also gave a case with the empty tomb, which is not personal testimony either.
Wait. No. That's all personal testimony. Like I could say the same thing about homeopathy. I could say we have an empty morgue bed where there was a guy who was dead and he took some homeopathy medicine and now he's raised from the dead, and there are 500 eyewitnesses of this homeopathic curing, and there are 10,000 people who are willing to die for this belief because of their conviction in homeopathy. None of that's evidence of homeopathy.
What's the evidence?
None of it. What's the
evidence that external sources testified to that, and they would have been in trouble if they had created this? If they created this hoax, they would have voluntarily done that and been in trouble, or like that possibly these were just a conspiracy. And I showed why those don't account for that.
Well, again, that's all testimony. All of that is still under
claiming that.
All of that is what? What am I claiming?
You're just claiming that there is this thing without giving evidence for it.
Right, it's made up. This is a made-up example. Like there are more eyewitness testimony accounts of homeopathy and Hindu miracles than there are of Christian miracles.
Right,
so
but the problem is
there are better examples. Yeah, right. The point is that no amount of testimony justifies homeopathy, just like no amount of testimony justifies the resurrection. I can add 10 times.
We can reject a lot of historical claims if we go merely by that. Then, like, there's a lot of historical that we can reject.
Only the miracle
on testimony.
Right, but remember, in my opening, I explicitly said if it has an implicit empirical basis, it's reasonable. If it doesn't have an implicit empirical basis, because then we have the combination of the conceptual testimony of I saw with the combination of the empirical evidence of it already being there, like the dog. If I said I saw a dog, the dog has the combination of the I saw conceptual testimony with the empirical evidence of dogs, like their bones, their DNA.
Why do we need a quote unquote empirical basis for it? We can account for this if this has enough historical evidence, and we establish that the supernatural is possible, and the historical, as I said earlier, the historical evidence probability, then we can build an inference. It's possible that the natural world exists, right? And then we build historical and scientific cases for certain things in the natural world, because we've established that the natural world is possible. In the same way, we've established that the supernatural is possible, and the resurrection is possible, and then we build probability based on that. in the case of the natural, with various natural properties or events, and then with the supernatural, the given event of the resurrection.
Right, and I'm saying if we take all of your evidence and we can match it one for homeopathy, for ghosts, for the Loch Ness Monster, for aliens, for UFOs, and it's not evidence for any of those, which means it's also not evidence of the resurrection.
And sorry,
Yep.
sorry, why is it not evidence for the resurrection again? Well,
Because we have exact same evidence of the exact same quality or better, usually better, for homeopathy, ghosts,
how
the Loch
so?
Ness Monster.
I showed why that was not. I showed how that didn't work. I
You showed how
I literally
it doesn't work.
Okay, yeah. I showed why that didn't work. Unless you want to provide.
Homeopathy is a type of alternative medicine where if you drink a certain kind of diluted water, it cures you of diseases. It has nothing to do with resurrection. It's a kind of pseudoscience. So
what's the
homeopathy,
evidence that works?
there are more eyewitness testimonies. There is better historical references. It has more historical basis. It has more eyewitness testimonies, as I said already. There is better evidence of homeopathy historically than there is for the resurrection.
So I didn't just say eyewitnesses in that state. I gave various.
Everything you said was eyewitnesses. Everything you said was testimony. You said somebody saw the tomb was empty. Somebody saw, or somebody claimed that they saw someone raised from the dead. That's testimony.
No,
Everything
people were
you said.
claiming that there was an empty tomb. It could be easily.
People were claiming. Claiming is a testimony.
Yes, but
everything.
But then we have to reject many historical things. If we don't at least use testimony, for it, then we can reject many historical.
No, again, I already refuted that. Remember, you could only reject things that don't have an empirical basis, which means only miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, the supernatural, UFOs. Those are the only things you can reject.
We're back to square one. Why? Again, we're back to square one. Why? Why is empirical? Why don't empirical basis work?
Because you need empirical evidence to filter out the imaginary stuff we made up and things that are actually reasonable to believe.
Okay.
Again, all of the evidence you presented works for Bigfoot, aliens, the Loch Ness Monster, ghosts, homeopathy, and all of these other made-up things, and it's not evidence for any of those. We don't believe any of those because the number of eyewitness testimony, the number of accounts, the number of believed things about these events and whether they believe someone rose from the dead or believe someone was healed is irrelevant. None of that is evidence.
No,
all of that is
philosophical we use philosophical and historical things, maybe sometimes even empirical things, to differentiate the made up from the true. We don't merely just use empirical basis for that. There's philosophical.
Right. There's lots of stuff we use. It's not the only criteria.
Depending on the kind of thing. This is a historical and philosophical thing. This has to do with philosophical possibility and historical probability. Two parts to this, and there says, and the empirical part, it falls under the philosophical part. So this says, so this is not, again, we don't merely just use empirical basis to differentiate between the false and the true. We use philosophical and historical basis for this.
Right, it's a combination of all of those, but the empirical is a necessary aspect. If it doesn't have an empirical basis, it's immediately imaginary. It's just imaginary. You don't even because there is no.
You mean unsupported, right?
Unsupported is something that exists in the world. It's only supported as an imaginary thing in our heads if it doesn't have an empirical basis.
Okay, so again, why is this the case? Because we're going to go in a circle again with this empirical basis thing.
I've already covered this many times. It's like because we need a way to differentiate between the imaginary stuff and the real stuff. The philosophical basis doesn't work. We can prove it doesn't work because it also works for Bigfoot, aliens, the Loch Ness Monster, ghosts, homeopathy. So that's out. That method does not work.
Philosophy merely establishes whether it gives a background for whether something's possible or probable. We're historically differentiating the merely possible to the possible and the probable. We're using history, and we're using a philosophical.
Right. So just starting with the philosophical background, the philosophical background of possibility works for Bigfoot, aliens, Loch Ness Monster, ghosts, and homeopathy. So the philosophical background does not differentiate between the imaginary stuff we made up and what's reasonable to believe.
Correct. I'm saying the historical part differentiates.
Right. I'm going by these one at a time. I'm going through these one at a time. So all of your accounts, 500 people saw this happen. That doesn't work either because that also accounts for Bigfoot. That also works for aliens. That also works for Loch Ness Monster. That also works for ghosts. That also works for homeopathy. So that also doesn't give us a way to differentiate between our imagination and what's reasonable to believe. People accounting this because it works for the so again, we need some way to differentiate between our imagination and what exists.
Yeah.
If some criteria can't do that, then it doesn't work, right? So,
Right.
like if I said, I need a way to tell if this ball is red or green, and I use green glasses and I can't tell which one is red or green, then the green glasses do not work to tell the difference between the balls.
Correct, but you need
So
to
if
show
I can
why
show-
this is a so-called green glass in this context, right? This is again.
No, it's completely irrelevant to that question. So right now, all I'm showing is that your criteria can't tell the difference between an imaginary thing and a real thing. Now, it doesn't actually matter whether the thing itself is imaginary or real. All I'm trying to show is that your criteria can't tell the difference. So, like if I said testimony, can testimony, eyewitness testimony of a certain number of people, tell the difference between an imaginary thing and a real thing? Well, there are millions of eyewitness testimonies of homeopathy. We know empirically homeopathy does not work. It's imaginary. Therefore, no, testimony cannot tell the difference between imaginary and real things. Do you follow my logic?
All right, so
empirical. So if I can,
right. So empirical basis cannot have any say on a supernatural events. This example. So I don't get your example.
No, you can absolutely have empirical examples of the supernatural. Like if I predicted there's a supernatural being who will give you a gold brick if you pray to it, and a gold brick materializes in front of you every time you pray to it, that's good evidence of the supernatural. So you can definitely have empirical evidence of the supernatural.
Same thing with the historical evidence, but except you're rejecting it based on philosophical empirical basis, and I'm showing why, and I'm showing why that does not work.
I have no idea what you just said. So my example is that you need a way to tell the difference between your imagination and the justifiable things to believe. If whatever criteria you're using can't do that, then that criteria is garbage and we throw it away. It doesn't work. It's not evidence. So testimony of a bunch of people, does that work to tell the difference between imaginary and real? No, because there's lots of testimony of homeopathy and ghosts and the Loch Ness Monster, which we know are not real. So testimony can't tell the difference.
Yeah,
so
but
that criteria is trash. We throw that away. It's not evidence.
Yeah, I'm showing why the historical criteria. I showed you why the historical criteria does not work for homeopathy. If you were to provide an actually good historical case for homeopathy, then and scientific case, of course, then I would accept it, because homeopathy is mainly an empirical phenomenon. But even if it was historical, provide historical and empirical understanding of what that is, and I showed you what your historical case.
There's better historical evidence for homeopathy by many magnitudes of order than there is for Christianity. Like we have modern, contemporary historical accounts of millions of people, eyewitnesses who've seen homeopathy work and have attested to it and have put their life on the line for it. There is better historical evidence for homeopathy by a significant margin than there is anything in the Bible. So how exactly did you show the historical account does not work for homeopathy?
Because the historical claims of homeopathy are separate, because I think they may be explained by scientific delusion of it, by scientific delusion that it scientifically works, homeopathy.
Anything can be explained by naturalistic explanations. There's a law of science called the problem of underdetermination. There are always infinitely many ways to explain anything that are empirically equivalent. So yes, the naturalistic explanations can explain everything about the resurrection, no problem. In fact, there's certain examples like mass hysteria, folia do, and communal reinforcement that do explain everything in the Bible, no problem. Which is why it is the consensus in history at the current time.
Wait a minute. So sorry if I'm strawmanning you, but are you saying that the problem of undetermination shows that metaphysical, like historical metaphysical and numerical claims are unsupported or fantasy?
No. I'm saying that because of the problem of underdetermination, the naturalistic explanations can be made to explain everything about Jesus' resurrection. All of the evidence can be accounted for.
Yeah, but they don't explain through probability. They merely explain through possibility.
No. The problem of underdetermination means that any given set of empirical data or any given set of evidence can necessarily be explained by infinitely many alternatives equally. They're all good. They can all explain all of it equally with the same probability. Mm-hmm. So, for example, like what knocked over that. Right. So you can't. So when you said that the naturalistic explanations can't explain these parts about the resurrection, that's wrong. That is incorrect. Yes, they can. They can't necessarily, because of the problems we know about the philosophy of science. You can always explain it. It's called ad hoc reasoning. You can always explain anything if you take enough time and effort to do it.
Right.
So the natural explanation can explain all the things about the Jesus resurrection. There's no problem.
The question is whether it can best explain it.
Right. I'm saying they can explain it to the same degree that you believe that the resurrection does. Exactly the same probabilistic degree. I would say even significantly better for certain reasons.
And why? And again, why is that the case? Are you saying because of the problem of determination?
Yes, the problem of determination means by definition that there are necessarily infinitely many ways to explain any given set of data.
But I understand how that relates to probability. I would assume that the problem of undetermination only appears to possibility.
No, it's probability. It's saying they're all equal. It's not just saying we can just explain it.
They're all equal probable. One divided by infinity.
No. They all can explain everything equally to the same degree.
No,
they're all exactly equally probable.
Yeah, if they're all equally probable, and they can all explain the data, then again it's one divided by infinity by mathematical inference, basic mathematical inference.
Right. So the point I'm making here is that yes, the natural explanations do explain everything about the resurrection exactly the same probabilistically as the resurrection, or as the supernatural explanation.
And again, I don't understand how the problem of determination applies to any supernatural given things.
It applies to everything. It's just saying there are infinitely many ways to explain it. It applies to the natural, the supernatural,
the supernatural. You have to differentiate between the probable and merely
probable. No. They're the same. So this means they can all explain it with the same level of probability and possibility. Exactly the same. There's no difference here. So they'll all be able to explain it. You can't tell a difference between them. They're all empirically equivalent.
Right.
Meaning they can all explain all of the empirical data, like this person said this, or this amount of testimony occurred, or there was an empty tomb, or there's the women at the grave. All of that can be explained by natural explanations perfectly.
Right. So
exactly the same probability.
Right. So
there's no problem.
So what I get from this, I'm sorry if I'm strawmanning the problem of determination or you, but according to the problem of determination, then then what would follow is that we cannot differentiate between any claims that we know to be fact, right? Like for instance, if I say that equals MC squared. Sorry if that's a bad example. We cannot differentiate because they're all equally probable.
Right. If we're only looking at past and present data, we can't tell the difference of which one is right, which is why we use future testable predictions, which is the empirical evidence stuff, to tell which one is the better explanation. That's why we use the future predictions, the empirical scientific evidence, to say this is a reason to believe this explanation isn't imaginary, because we can use it to project into the future about something we don't know yet. And if it gets it right before any of the other ones do, that's a good reason to say, yeah, this is probably correct.
Right. I disagree. I disagree. Well, I disagree with that. If it's merely establishing an empirical, if it says that we have to do it by merely future testable predictions, which is a scientific method according to you, we still during scientific principles sorry. The scientific method isn't, again, not the only way to do this, which is why I think the problem of determination is limited in its scope, in saying that merely future testable predictions are what work. Otherwise, we would not be able to make a lot of historical claims. But what you would say to that is, well, they have an empirical basis. To what degree? They're still not the scientific method.
Right. So going back, my claim is that you need some way to tell the difference between your imagination and reality. Now, you're right that there may be other ways other than empirical future predictions, but you would need to present one of those ways. And I can prove you wrong and show that doesn't work if that same way can work for the imaginary things. Because if it can work for the imaginary things, then it can't tell the difference between imaginary things and real things, right? Do you follow my reasoning?
So, yeah. Sorry. Could you repeat that again? I'm sorry. I'm
okay,
sorry.
So the main claim here is that whatever criteria you want to use to claim as evidence the resurrection happened, it has to be able to filter out the imaginary explanations, the stuff we make up, the blue fairies, the magical leprechauns, all the stuff that we know is just made up. If it can't do that, if the same evidence works equally for the resurrection as it does for the blue magical fairies, then your evidence can't tell the difference.
Because there's historical probability to it.
Right, and so you would need to present some example of evidence that can't work for the imaginary examples. And if I can show it does work for the imaginary examples, then it's not evidence.
No, the burden is on you to show these possible explanations in any way until historical probability. I showed that with the resurrection. You have not showed it for the blue fairy, whatever.
Right. Which is why I went with homeopathy. Homeopathy has better historical evidence by a significant margin than does Christianity. So if we were going to accept historical evidence, we should accept homeopathy works.
Why?
And it doesn't.
Okay, again, we're back to square one. Why is that?
Because homeopathy has better historical evidence. All of the historical evidence used for Jesus, homeopathy has that times 100.
I showed why that doesn't work. It's a mere. I didn't just use mere personal testimony. I used other context to show which theories can best account for the data. And I would assume since there's a scientific method of showing
what example did you use that isn't testimony?
What example did I not use to testimony?
No. What example? You said you used things other than testimony. What example did you use that was not testimony?
If you're talking about historical testimony, then I use, for instance, like the empty tomb. You would argue is based on historical testimony, right? But
Yep.
So is every other event. I'm not claiming that these. You see, what I'm trying to say is, I'm not follow my reasoning. I'm not trying to claim that these facts in and of themselves are supernatural things. These are based on historical testimony, and we're merely saying which theory can best account for this data. I'm giving natural facts, and I'm just seeing which explanation can best account for them. I mean,
Right. So everything you presented was historical testimony, which means all you have is testimony. That's it. That's all the evidence you presented is testimony.
That's like a lot of historical facts that we accept as true today are based on historical testimony.
No. I can accept everything about history that has an empirical basis, the implicit empirical basis, which means the only things about history I reject are miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, and UFOs.
Why?
Everything else about history.
Because you have an implicit bias. That's circular reasoning. You say
implicit empirical basis, not a bias.
Right. I understand. I use the terminology empirical bias. But why do you think? The question is, why do you think that these don't work? That's the problem here. Like
because I can prove they don't. I can prove they don't work.
All right, go ahead.
Because remember, if you have a criteria that can't differentiate between imaginary made-up stuff and what's reasonable to believe, then that criteria is provably false. It provably does not work. So if you have testimony, can testimony tell the difference between imaginary made-up stuff and reality? And the answer is no, and I can prove this because we have more testimony of homeopathy than we do of
I just showed why that didn't work. Oh, homeopathy, but you
didn't show anything.
Yeah. Yes,
again, homeopathy is provably has a better historical basis than anything in the book.
Yeah, but I would assume that there's empirical reasons for why that doesn't work as well. And you're empirical, and I don't believe you've shown empirically or in any other way why this doesn't work. You've only created philosophically iffy territories, like the problem of indetermination, which shows the problem of indetermination.
You want me to prove supernatural can't exist, and you think that's what it takes to get evidence?
No, that's not what I'm saying.
That's proving negative.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. What I'm saying is either you need to show philosophically or in whatever way you want, or empirically, whatever way you want, that it's impossible, or you have to show historical improbability, or there's a more historically probable explanation for the event. That's all I'm saying.
No, there's other ways to prove it. Like in math, there's certain kinds of proofs, like a proof by contradiction, proof by contrapositive.
Reductio ad absurdum. Right.
No,
yes. No, reductio ad absurdum is basically comparable to mathematical proof by contradiction.
Not exactly, but
reductio ad absurdum is like the philosophical way of showing the mathematical. Mathematical proof via contradiction. Yeah.
No, it's not, because a reductio ad absurdum doesn't need to be logically contradictory to be an absurd result. So
right, but it can be logically. But a reductio ad absurdum can be shown.
That's a different topic. So let's try to stay on topic here. So again, if I can show that whatever criteria you're using can't differentiate between imaginary made-up stuff and reality, that proves it's false. I immediately win the debate.
No, I should historical differentiation. I'm sorry.
So if you present this historical data, and I can show this historical data can't tell the difference between imaginary and reality, then it loses. It's wrong. It's immediately false. It's done. It goes in the garbage. So I can prove that it does that because there is objectively, as accepted by every historian ever in all of history, better historical evidence of homeopathy than of the resurrection of Jesus. The fact that we have empirical evidence against homeopathy doesn't help your case. Does not in any way help your case.
No. Yes, it does. Yes, it does.
No, it doesn't.
No, and I also showed historically why that homeopathy doesn't work. Yeah,
How did you do that? You didn't show anything of the sort. You just keep saying that.
These people reported individual events, and they did that via scientific delusion, because they believed that they were scientifically correct even though they were not. That's the better naturalistic explanation for then that actually works. And also combined with empirical evidence against it, naturalistic explanation of scientific delusion, I would assign more probability to than the theory that it just simply homeopathy actually works. Yeah.
Okay, and why would you not do that for the resurrection? What's the difference between the resurrection?
What's the difference between the resurrection?
Yeah, why would you not do that?
Scientific delusion, because scientific delusion does not work for the resurrection. These people die. These people died for something they claim to see, not just for something that they claim to believe. Because you see the difference between someone who dies for something, just anything like the 9/11 terrorists, or something that they claim to see with their eyes. Like the word martyr in Greek means something that they claim to witness by their own eyes. And that's a separate thing from they just claimed America. They just believed it. Belief in something is different than belief in something you have claimed to see with your own eyes.
No, it's not. The things in your memories are beliefs. So the things that you believe that you saw are also beliefs. There's no difference there.
Liars make lousy martyrs. Again, liars make lousy martyrs, and scientific delusion does not account for the conversion of Paul and the conversion of James and the empty tomb.
Yes,
in fact,
it does.
No psychological explanation can account for the empty tomb.
No, that's false. They all necessarily can. Again, probable determination, we can prove that false immediately.
Yeah,
yes,
right.
they can all account for that. They can all account for that perfectly.
Well, the problem of indetermination, again, it's still 1 divided by infinity, and we still have to differentiate.
No. The point is that any natural explanation can explain all of those things perfectly well, exactly better than your explanation can.
Why?
They can always explain.
The problem of indetermination does not show how these naturalistic explanations can.
It shows that they can't necessarily. It's literally what the problem means is that they can necessarily do this. It's one of the biggest
problems. Are better than scientific explanations?
Got a 1 minute.
Yes, that literally any explanation can do that. That's the point. There's infinitely many that can all do that necessarily. That's what the problem is.
Does that apply to the natural supernatural dichotomy?
Yes. No, it applies to everything. Applies to everything. The natural, the supernatural, the ubernatural, the super duper natural applies to literally everything.
All right, so then we can say the same. Okay, so then we can say the same thing for any natural explanation as well, because if the problem of indetermination also worked, then we would also have to reject the scientific method as it also applies to science. I believe.
Because again, it only applies to past and present data, or past and present data, which is when we go to the future testable predictions, because the future testable prediction gives us a way to tell the difference. That's the point.
Right. I disagree. I disagree then with the problem of indetermination scope. I would. So I would disagree then with the problem.
15 seconds left.
So yeah, the problem of indetermination scope, because then it does not apply, because that's only applying to natural explanations. That does not apply to supernatural.
No, it doesn't. It does apply to supernatural.
It does. It literally is about science. It literally is about science. Yeah.
I hate to cut you guys off. I totally appreciate you both. We have run out of time for the open discussion, but we are restarting the clock for 20 minutes for the Q&A. And we appreciate your questions, everybody. Thanks so much. Let's see. Trying to think of anything. That was excellent. That was very enjoyable, stimulating. So, Steven Steen, Gregory, he says, thanks for your super chat, Steven Steen. He says, Gregory for the win, amazing kid. So, got a fan out there. And then,
I would actually say it's not necessarily about winning. Maybe it's more of an open discussion between me and TJump, who share different views, and in the end, I agree that we all have a human bias, which is reason is a slave of the passions. In the end of the day, yeah.
Thank you very much, Brian Stevens, and thank you as well.
Oh yeah, Brian Stevens. I like Brian Stevens. He's always like, he's very respectful. He always like, nice to anyone who disagrees with. I like Brian Stevens. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for your super chat, Brian. He says Gregory only has evidence people believe to claim. So that's if you want to respond, you can.
That's not the only evidence I gave. I gave for the empty tomb and various other facts, and I gave natural facts. And I'm just saying which can best account for the data: the the resurrection or any other theories.
Gotcha. Next up, thanks for your super generous super chat, Ronald Mendonca. We really appreciate that. He says, for Gregory, the Jesus story is a religious story from one religious book of many religious books from that place and era. Please read all the other religious books before drawing any conclusion. They can't all be right, but they can all be wrong.
Right, so, okay, so that's separate. Just because there's many other religions does not necessarily entail that one religion may not be correct. In just one book, I didn't use that. I used various facts that can be attested from secular sources. I could have used a lot of Gospels and other that, but I used a lot of secular sources, and I used early creeds. I didn't just use one book. And these natural facts, when they add up, we have to find a theory that can better account for the data. That's the thing.
You got it. Mara, thanks for your super chat. She said, Greg, what power has Christianity given to mankind?
What power has Christianity given to mankind?
That's right.
I would say that it shaped a lot of our the way we think about modern day morality. In some ways, this may be controversial, but I think it liberated many people, because Jesus said, and Paul said in Romans, and that not Romans, that all men are free, that all men are equal. Maybe it was in Galatians 1:23. I don't remember. Yeah, and again, I think it influenced a lot of the way our principles worked. And originally there was discrimination going on that came from Christians and elaborated into the law. But I believe that after we evolved to understand the principles of Christianity, we evolved towards it better, and now we have a much better system. In the West, I believe, was how do I frame this? The West was one of the first cultures to establish a system where equality was one of its top priorities. So yeah, that's my view.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. The big gulp. I like it. All right, Brian Stevens has another super chat for Gregory. Thanks for your super chat, Brian. He says, to Gregory, you say history can give a probability for the resurrection. If this is true, give the mathematical probability and how you found it.
Sorry. Could you repeat that question again? I didn't catch that again.
No problem. He said, you say history can give a probability for the resurrection. If this is true, give the mathematical probability and how you found it.
The mathematical probability of the resurrection?
That's right.
I don't believe that there's a mathematical probability for the resurrection. I believe that there's a historical probability. I wouldn't say the resurrection relies on mathematical probability. It strictly relies on historical probability and a philosophical background of possibility.
Gotcha. And also, Brian Stevens, he said, there are many. I'm going to jump ahead. One of them, he said, Gregory is really smart and will do great things. So that was
Thank you very much. I hope to, at least.
And then he had also said, I've got a lot of respect for you and appreciate your thoughts and debates. So you got a fan out there, Gregory.
Yep, thank you as well.
Then
yeah, thank you as well very much, Brian Stevens. I really like him. Yeah, he's a good guy.
He is. He's been a huge supporter.
I've seen.
Steven Steen, thanks for your super chat. He said, TJump, the default is not imaginary. Do better. ...
How do you think all knowledge comes to us? It comes to us through our imagination, through our qualia sense experience. So yes, everything does start off as imaginary. It's kind of the point of Descartes' I think, therefore I am, necessarily starts off as imaginary.
Gotcha. Next up, Mara, thanks for your super chat. Mara said, TJump, what empirical evidence do you have for freedom of will or for the existence of yourself? All empirical evidence is based ultimately on testimonial of the scientist observer.
Well, there is no free will. Free will is logically incoherent, so there isn't any empirical evidence of that. There is empirical evidence that I exist because we can empirically test the weight and the mass and the speed and the energy of all the particles that make me up. So we can definitely have empirical evidence of me. It's not absolutely certain, but yes, we do have empirical evidence of that.
You bet. Next up, thanks for that super chat, by the way, and for your answer, Tom. Steven Steen said, Greg, you can use, and then in capital letters, HML as probability. No number needed. Hope I said that right. Does that make sense?
HML. Wait a minute. What do you mean HML?
I wasn't sure. Yeah, I have to ask. I'll keep an eye out if Steven has an answer for that. But next up, Themcar, thanks for your super chat. He said, if homeopathy is reported by millions to have alleviated suffering, it would in fact constitute evidence that homeopathy works.
Again, it's
Well,
only
this
for
is for Tom, I think.
sorry.
I may be wrong. Tom, I think.
Maybe we could do. Maybe
I'm pretty sure. We can both respond to it. It's totally fine.
Okay.
Yeah, you can just Google homeopathy in the UK. Just the UK alone has millions of testimony of it working. It's a pretty big market in the UK and the US. Homeopathy is a really well-funded pseudoscience that does nothing and has lots of testimony of it working. It's pretty hilarious. But no, that's not evidence it actually works. The testimony isn't at all evidence.
You got it. Thanks so much. And then if you want to respond to Gregory, I didn't mean to shut you down. Sorry about that. If you want to give a response.
The homeopathy?
Yeah.
Again, so I would say the best explanation for homeopathy would be scientific delusion, and it does, in my opinion, it does better account for the fact than that claim, because first of all, that gives them no background knowledge and reduces down to mere possibility with slight probability at best, and there's empirical evidence against homeopathy. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Yeah.
You got it. Next up, the Sigifredos Rabia. Thanks for your super chat. They said, TJ, if supernaturalism doesn't exist, what criteria would be needed to show God that's not limited to quote-unquote stars spelling out God, etc., that be supernatural itself?
So I would accept any kind of testable predictions. I apply this not only to science and empiricism, but also to the supernatural, the ubernatural, the super-duper natural, just anything at all. The way to tell the difference between something that's imaginary and something that exists is future testable predictions. It doesn't matter what it is, if it's natural or supernatural. So the way to tell that a God would exist would be like if you could make future testable predictions. If I could say Yahweh exists and every time I pray to Yahweh, a gold brick is going to materialize in front of me, and that happens, that's good evidence of Yahweh. Or at least there's good evidence that there's some being up there who's listening to your prayers and responding to them. There's other properties of God, like all-powerful and all-knowing. I wouldn't believe those based on that kind of evidence. You need a new kind of evidence for that kind of stuff. But if you could make future testable predictions, that would be good evidence of some kind of being up there who's listening to you.
You got it. Thanks so much. Brian Stevens, thanks for your super chat. He said, people have died for homeopathy claims.
Yes, they have. Just like the testimony of the apostles who are willing to die because they believed in Jesus, there are people who have died because they believed in homeopathy, and they believed that just by drinking water or just by taking an energy of the universe and karma and stuff, it'll purely like reinvigorate their bodies, but they just die because they're wrong. They just have a false belief, just like the apostles would have about Jesus' resurrection.
We'll give Gregory, I think it was for you, so if you want to give a response to that, and Thomas, you are welcome to.
Yes, so I would say the scientific delusion, or any kind of delusion, whether it be of any kind, can propel someone. It can propel someone to die. I would argue, however, that the resurrection theory that does not work with the resurrection. But as far as I know, I would say that scientific delusion, yes, it's possible that homeopathy is true. But I would say that scientific delusion, a lot of people can die for such things based on their belief that it's based on their belief that it's scientifically correct, even though it is a scientific delusion. Yeah, that's how I would respond. Yeah.
You got it. Thanks so much. Next up. Sigifredo Sarabia, thanks for your super chat. They said, Greg, if Job built a ladder for angels, what's the scientific and historical evidence or explanation why they just didn't fly up?
Sorry, I don't get that one. Sorry, I don't get that one.
I think that based on the rest of it, they also said, what about the talking donkey? I think they're maybe asking what...
They're asking him to try and explain the silly stories in the Bible and how they can really make sense, essentially. But it's not really... It's a different topic.
Thank you, Thomas.
So, actually,
for the silly part. But
yes, as far as the Old Testament
what he interprets as silly.
So as far as the Old Testament goes, I have a view that's actually a lot different from a lot of Christian apologetics, and that's that in some sense some biblical stories can be taken with a lot of metaphorical and historical grain of salt, and maybe they may represent other truths, and I have to look into that, see if there's any evidence that can kind of show that these biblical stories, whether or not they're true. So yeah, I'd have to look into that. But I would say a metaphorical and historical grain of salt could also work. I think it's called the it's called neo-orthodoxy and systematic theology, systematic and biblical theology. So yeah, otherwise, I'd have to look into that, see if there's any real historical evidence or any kind of evidence for those biblical stories, and then I'd make claims. Yeah.
You got it. Next up, thanks for your super chat, Rob Plutonium. He said, "Do you believe in evolution, Gregory?"
Yes, I do. Yeah, I actually did a debate recently on it, where I debated Guzman 1611 on the scientific evidence for evolution. It's easily one of the most supported theories on this planet, evolution. You can create a lot of beautiful evolutionary you can create beautiful theories in evolutionary psychology that have emerged and explained a lot of our behavior. And it's I definitely believe in evolution. Yeah.
You got it. Thanks so much. And next up, last one for the super chats, Tez Stickel. I hope I pronounced that right. Thanks for your super chat. He said, restitution for my infraction. Appreciate that. I appreciate your humble heart there, being, understanding that we're looking out for the debaters. So next up, new subscribers, Mrs. Rambo 7. Thanks for subscribing. We're glad to have you here. And Nicholas Long, we're thrilled to have you here as well. Thanks for subscribing. If there's anybody I missed, forgive me. We're glad to have you here. It's always, we're really shooting for that diverse, you could say thought diverse community where, no matter where you come from, we're glad you're here. And with that, questions. Elias Fake Name. Question for Gregory. Is it more likely that Joseph of Arimathea was a real person from a place that never existed, or that an author made up a literary character from, quote-unquote, best disciple town?
Why? Okay, so I'm nearly confused as to why they would make up the story of Joseph of Arimathea. Is this question that Joseph of Arimathea is most likely not a real person?
Yeah, I couldn't read it one more time. To be honest, it takes a strong working memory. It's a long question. Is it more likely that Joseph of Arimathea was a real person from a place that never existed, or that an author made up a literary character?
A place that never existed? What place?
Real person from a place. I think they're trying to. I think they're. Yeah. It's a little bit confusing for me too. Or that an author made up. Tom, what do you make of it? Or that an author made up a literary character from, quote unquote, best disciple town.
Well, Arimathea is an actual city, so I don't know if he may be trying to say that Arimathea didn't exist, or because Joseph of Arimathea, if he was a mythical character, or the city was mythical, then he might be claiming Arimathea it doesn't exist, but it does exist. So I don't know exactly.
Gotcha. Yes. We can come back to that if they add extra to that. Rich Gilmore, thanks for your question. They said, question for Gregory. assuming the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is sufficient, do you believe the saints were raised as described in Matthew, and what is the evidence for this? Thanks.
Saints were raised from the dead?
Yes.
I'd have to look. Yeah, I'd have to look into that. See if there's see the historical evidence for the saints being raised. As for now, that's for maybe it could be taken with a metaphorical grain of salt. Otherwise, I would give uncertainty and look into the historical evidence for saints or whatever. Until then, I will leave you with uncertainty, with historical uncertainty, and as to that.
You bet. Thanks so much. And Jesus is Lord had a question. Thanks so much for your question, Jesus is Lord. He asks, Tom, what do you think happened to Jesus' body?
Probably thrown into a ditch with a mass grave, like all crucifixions.
Gotcha. Landon Freeman, thanks for your question. Also for TJump, getting a little action in the Q&A, Tom. He said, do you believe science is the only reliable method of obtaining truth?
No, I believe it's the only reliable method to differentiate between our imagination and what exists in reality that I know of right now. There could always be more.
You got it. Next up, he had a follow-up question, was what are your main criticisms of scientism?
Yeah, scientism is the claim that science is the only way to know everything, which is clearly false. I mean, you can know things, a priori things, that just by thinking about them, like logic and math and triangles have three sides, all those kinds of things, without any reference to the external world. Yeah. So science's only function is to differentiate between whether or not our imaginary explanations apply to reality or whether or not they're just imaginary. So it only has a specific usage. It can't be used to understand everything or to know everything.
Gotcha. And next up, Rich Gilmore, thanks for your question. He said, if the resurrection is proven historically, with causes/reasons defined, does this not disempower the purpose of a miracle, relegating it to just another objective fact like any other?
So is this claim something along the lines of this, like that would remove the whole purpose of a miracle, giving evidence for the miracle?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, yeah, to some existential degree, yes, it may have that kind of significance, but on an evidential and metaphysical level, I still believe that miracles are just miracles. And I guess if you're going down that route, then I guess it would be circular to assume that miracles are by definition the least probable and therefore removing the purpose of it. So yes, we can create historical reasons for historical facts, and again, yes, see what can best account for the data. Yeah. You
got it. Thanks so much.
That was a good question, by the way.
Yeah, I never heard that one. That's an interesting one. Next up, let's see. Randy Rivero Arevalo, thanks for your hello from Cuba. I got a kick out of that. I just like that. I'm thrilled to have you stop by. I've been to Cuba. I loved it. So let's see. Anyway, sorry, I'm just excited. So Brain Gel, thanks for your question. Question for Gregory. He says, aliens are a possibility, and we have lots of testimony of alien abductions. Should we believe in alien abductions?
Should we believe in the alien abductions?
Right.
No, again, so possibility does not entail probability, first of all. Second of all, as far as it appearing to many people, would they die for those beliefs? Actually, yes. Actually, people have died for those beliefs, but did they die for something they claim to see with their own eyes, or something, or just some delusion that they had gotten
they claim to see it based on their own eyes. That's what they would claim to be taken up to see it.
Right, so I would assume, so I could account for that with hallucination/delusion, psychological explanation, which I believe can account for the disciples' believed part, but in combination with the disciples said, of which the hallucination theory and psychological explanations cannot account for, then I would create a cumulative case for that. But otherwise, yeah, that does not. But otherwise, yeah, if I were to use that fact alone that the disciples believed, then yeah, I would, yes, I would argue that the hallucination and psychological explanations in general can for the most part, account for that. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. So sorry, I'm like scattered. Okay, Landon Freeman, thanks for your question. He says, for Gregory, what are your main criticisms of scientism defined as an excessive belief in the power of scientific knowledge and techniques? He might have meant exclusive instead of excessive.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, my main criticisms of scientism would be, first of all, there's many other kinds of evidence, such as historical evidence, philosophical evidence, mathematical evidence. Scientific and empirical evidence is not the only kind of evidence that exists in this that exists. There are, however, so yeah, for that reason, I would say scientism works. Rationalism is another story, which I would say a lot of Christian apologetic evidentialists who are strict evidentialists, rather than getting into the existential field, which I believe have faulty assumptions in and of itself, and the new atheists in general. I would say that that's where they believe in rationalism, which is that rationality just we need evidence for something, and we can support metaphysical conclusions from that. Which, yes, I would agree with. If that's the only reason for belief in something, then I would disagree. Then I would somewhat disagree. But yeah, that's my view.
You got it. Thanks so much. Nick J asks, question for Gregory. Herodotus reported that certain wooden watercrafts were able to carry a weight load of up to a ton of material. Should this be accepted, especially since he claimed he witnessed it?
Did he die? Did he die for something? Did he claim to see it? Was there like any other kind of alternate historical explanation, like the empty tomb and other stuff like that for it?
I think you betcha. Thanks so much. Next up, we appreciate your question as well. And this is from Nick J. Question for Gregory. How did you determine that a tomb that is empty was the same one that Jesus was supposedly in?
Because the public knowledge as it was in the tomb of Sanhedrin, remember Joseph of Arimathea.
Gotcha. And let's see, Louis R. question. Thanks for your question. Do you realize that you dismissed a historical argument only by philosophical reasons? The historical evidence would still stand.
Yeah. By the way, may I go to the bathroom? I really have to go.
Yes, you bet. I think this is for Tom.
Yeah.
I don't know what they're talking about. Like, I discounted historical evidence on a philosophical reason. Historical evidence is testimony, so it's essentially the same as philosophical reasons. So, yes, I mean, yeah, we can reject all testimony if it doesn't have an empirical basis. It's as simple as that. It's like same as homeopathy and UFOs and aliens. It's just if testimony isn't good enough.
Gotcha. Themcar, thanks for your super chat. We appreciate it. They ask, TJump, you believe there is no free will. Is that how you live your life? Do you assume that you have no agency?
Well, that question is a confusion between like how you live your life and what you believe fundamentally exists. Like, free will is incoherent. Either things are determined by reasons or they are done for no reasons, in which case they're random. Those are the only possibilities. So logically, free will isn't even an option. There's no way to actually articulate what free will could be. Now, I live my life based on my desires and my compatibilist free will, as Dan Dennett phrases it, but the actual objective free will doesn't exist in that sense. But it has no effect on how I live my life.
You got it. Thanks so much. Next up, Rob C. asks, what grounds do we have to disbelieve the testimony of UFO abductees? And that's for both debaters.
So, sorry, could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
No problem. He says, what grounds do we have to disbelieve the testimony of UFO abductees, people who have been abducted, who claim to be abducted? Both debaters he would like to see respond.
So,
I'd
yeah.
say that there's no empirical basis for UFOs, just like there's no empirical basis for homeopathy or unicorns or Bigfoot or Loch Ness monsters, and so we can reject all of them because they don't have an empirical basis, and so we can just
UFOs,
conclude they're imaginary.
yeah, but, well, yeah, I don't know. Maybe what if the UFOs and aliens are, let's just say, natural?
That's fine. Like my criteria applies to natural and supernatural and anything. So if it doesn't
Oh
have
yeah,
an empirical basis,
yeah, gotcha. As far as I would say that the conspiracy theory, either like that, maybe they were lying. If there's any other factors for that, then I would induce a psychological explanation, which may work. And and um and I would, since we live in the modern world, it's hard to put a mythic theory into this, as that would usually apply to much more earlier events. So yeah, I would either induce a psychological explanation or that they were or that they were lying. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, Liam Ayrton. Thanks for your question. He said, for Gregory, is there a part of the Bible that you find hard to believe is fact?
A literal interpretation, of Genesis as a literal 6 days, but I don't think that's what even the Bible says. So that would be kind of hard to. And a lot of things I would say in the Bible are relatively hard to believe. Maybe not including the resurrection if we were looking at it in and of itself without the evidence. But yeah, there are some fantastical phenomena that are going on that I would induce a metaphorical explanation, most likely, rather than the explanation which is in of itself that happened, and I would have to look for more historical evidence for that. Otherwise, I would assume the view of neo-orthodoxy in the Bible to account for that. Yeah.
You got it. Thomas?
what was the question?
It was... Oh, it was for Gregory. Sorry about that. I was back. For some reason, my mind jumped to the UFO question. The Christ Teller. To Gregory, do you believe in evolution of mankind? And if you do, how is it compatible with the Bible?
Okay, so yes, I do believe in evolution. An earlier question was asked on that, and in case you didn't hear, I had a debate recently with Guzman 1611 on the scientific evidence for evolution, and I would say it does account. It can be compatible with the Bible because I would take a view of the Bible called concordism, which is that day one, maybe there was the earliest Earth forms, and before that, the Big Bang, everything. And then as slowly species emerged, day 7, the species of the mammals, apes, and eventually humans. And the word for the beginning, it does not necessarily have to be in Hebrew, it does not necessarily have to be it doesn't necessarily have to be a definite beginning, and can be an infinite chain, even though I do not believe in infinite universe. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Franco Stagno, thanks for your question. Said, since I'm so impressed with Gregory, have you cast out any demons yet from someone,
No.
Gregory?
No, I have not. I haven't cast out any demons. Just to make that clear, I'm not like a supernatural entity or anything.
Gotcha.
Just a normal guy.
You betcha. Thanks so much. Next up, Nick Jr., thanks for your question. He said, does Gregory reject the eyewitness claims of witchcraft in Salem?
I don't reject the eyewitness claims. I reject that goes back to the metaphysical claim of witchcraft being a reliable form of conducting events. Yeah, that's what I would say.
I actually have a question for Gregory about that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Mm-hmm, yeah, good.
So, like if I'm wearing a pair of green glasses and I'm trying to tell the difference between a green ball and a red ball, and the green glasses can't tell which is green or red, the fact that I know beforehand which is green or red doesn't mean that the green glasses are now okay to use, right? The green glasses are still completely useless to tell the difference, correct?
Yeah, but we need to give evidence that we are using green glasses in the sense, and what the evidence is prior to the green glasses for the green or red, right?
Right. That was kind of my analogy there, is that the testimony is kind of like the green glasses, and the fact that we know homeopathy there's empirical evidence against homeopathy is like knowing which one is red and which one is green beforehand. But that doesn't mean that the green glasses are now functional. They're still broken.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, the green glasses are still broken. However, again, I don't know how this ties back to the.
All right, that's fine. If that makes sense, that's good. That's fine. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. I would agree with you.
Gotcha. Elias Fake Name, thanks for your question. He said, why do the debaters think Arimathea is a real place?
Well, I believe there were historical accounts of Muslim or Islam historians mentioning it, like in 700 ADs or something. So, I mean, I grant it as a historical place. Like, it was a city. Like, why not? It's not like it's a magical thing, so I have no reason to reject it.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Utopia Blaster, thanks for your question. They said, TJump, is intuition a valid cognitive epistemic function? And they linked an article to Live Science.
For conceptual conclusions, yes. For empirical conclusions, no. So, like, we have intuitions that objects are solid. If you pick up a glass, you think it's a solid object. 99% of that object is empty space between the electron and the proton. If you touch a metal object and a plastic object, the metal object will feel intuitively colder, but they're exactly the same temperature, room temperature. Our intuitions are fundamentally flawed for describing what reality is like, and so we need to use the empirical method to filter out whether or not any particular intuition is describing an imaginary thing produced by our mind, or whether it's describing something that exists in the world.
Yeah. Actually, by the way, can we? You want to go back to that green ball, the green glasses point? I actually kind of wanted to address that. Could you repeat the green ball thing? I want to get into that.
Repeat it? Yeah, so if we're trying to tell that we have two balls, one's green, one's red, and we're trying to tell which one is the green ball, and we're wearing green glasses, they both look green. So we can't tell which one is green because the green glasses don't give us a way to differentiate. But if we already know which one is green, like we put the green glasses on after holding the balls, that doesn't mean the green glasses work. The green glasses still don't work. We can't use them to tell the difference, even if there's some other reason that we know which one is green.
Yeah, so wait a minute. How does this connect to the resurrection, though?
Because if we have testimony is the green glasses. Testimony can't tell the difference between imaginary things and reasonable things to believe about the world. So the testimony is the green glasses. But like you said with the homeopathy, was like we have empirical evidence that homeopathy doesn't work. That's like already knowing which ball is green before we put the glasses on. That doesn't make the testimony.
I use empirical evidence. Empirical evidence is different from philosophical circularity, correct?
Yes. What?
Yeah,
So again, my analogy is that there is empirical evidence against homeopathy, but that doesn't mean that testimony for homeopathy doesn't work now because of the empirical evidence. The testimony didn't work with or without the empirical evidence. The empirical evidence doesn't add or take away from how invalid the testimony.
The testimony doesn't work. We need to understand the prior knowledge of the 40 green glasses with the testimony. Why?
Right.
Why do we know that the testimony doesn't work? Are we talking about testimony to a supernatural event, or which one are you doing?
Testimony to anything. It doesn't matter if it's natural or supernatural. The testimony is like the green glass. The testimony can't tell the difference between an imaginary, made-up thing and a real thing.
Well, it can make certain probabilistic instances. Yes, it can.
Nope.
Yep.
Nope. That's just kind of the point. That was the point of the course of the history. Literally can't do that.
We're going to jump to the last question, if that's okay. Sorry to interrupt you guys. We've got a question from Icarus. Icarus, we appreciate your question. And they said, without cardinal sin, in parentheses, Adam and Eve didn't exist, what did Jesus die for? I think that's for Gregory.
Jesus died for mankind, correct? Jesus died for mankind. I still need to see. I would still need to see the evidence for Adam and Eve, or otherwise I would take it as a metaphorical story, which I would say differentiates myself from a lot of traditional Christian apologists. So, but yeah, until I could see the historical evidence for Adam and Eve, I would not accept first of all. But second of all, Jesus died for mankind, correct? Not Adam and Eve necessarily. And if he did mention any of that, then that would be metaphorical about how Adam and Eve represents mankind.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. So, with that, I want to say thanks for everybody's questions. We appreciate it. Also, we appreciate everybody being here. Just in terms of our speakers, we've, like I said, all of the speakers that we've asked have been willing to come on for free, and so we owe them. I owe them big time, and we appreciate you guys understanding that we're trying to want them to feel loved and encouraged when they're here. So we appreciate that all of you guys do that so well. That means a lot. And we are now going to just remind you one more time, links are in the description. So if you're like, oh man, that TJump, man, he's a true gangsta, you can check out his link in the description. And Gregory does not yet have a link, but perhaps someday we will let you know when it happens. And just again, want to say thanks so much to the speakers. We really appreciate you guys being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us on.
Thanks for having us on. Yeah.
Hope you guys have a great...
Yeah, this is an honor, the TJump and James, yeah.
Thank you, Gregory. The honor is all ours. So take care, everybody. You have a great rest of your Saturday. Thank you.